My daughter had been dating him for 4 months before I finally met him. She'd mentioned his name a few times, Richard, and told me he was in wealth management, that he was thoughtful and kind, that he listened to her in ways she hadn't experienced before. My wife, Carol, was more excited about the whole thing than I was. She'd set an extra place at the table before I'd even finished my coffee that Saturday morning, and she was humming while she folded the napkins, which she only does when she's genuinely happy about something. I want to say right now that Carol is very much alive, and she was standing right next to me when all of this unfolded. I could not have done any of it without her. I'm 67 years old. I spent 22 years willed. I spent 22 years with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, working financial fraud cases. After I retired from that, I spent another decade consulting for law firms and insurance companies, the kind of work where you read a person's financial history the way a doctor reads an X-ray. I have looked at more fraudulent documents than I can count. I have sat across tables from men and women who could look you directly in the eye and tell you something completely false without a single flicker of anything. I know what that looks like now. I didn't always. My daughter, I'll call her my daughter throughout, because that's who she is to me. Every part of this story is 34. She's a physical therapist. She works with veterans mostly, which tells you something about who she is as a person. She's not naive. She has good judgment. She has seen people at their lowest and helped them climb back up. So when she told me Richard was different from anyone she'd dated before, I believed her enough to press the good shirt and show up with an open mind. He arrived 12 minutes late, which is not necessarily meaningful, but I noticed it. He brought wine, a bottle I recognize as mid-range priced, presented like it was something impressive, which is also not necessarily meaningful, but I noticed that too. He had good teeth and a firm handshake, and he called me sir without being asked, which most people my age appreciate. Carol appreciated it. She touched his arm when he handed her the wine and said something about how lovely it was. Dinner was good. Carol made her pot roast, which has been perfect for 31 years and remains perfect today. Richard talked mostly about himself, but in a way that was skillful enough that it didn't feel that obvious. He asked questions occasionally, and they were the right kinds of questions. Not too personal, not too shallow. He asked me how I'd spent my career, and I said federal government, financial sector, now retired. He nodded and moved on, which most people do. Nobody wants to hear about tax fraud at the dinner table. He and my daughter sat close together. She laughed at things he said. I watched her face when she looked at him. She was happy, or she looked happy. And I had promised Carol before he arrived that I would give this man a fair chance, and I was giving it. After Carol brought out the pie, she asked Richard if he wanted coffee, and he said yes. And she went to the kitchen, and my daughter excused herself to use the restroom. Richard looked at me across the table. He said, "I'm glad we finally got to do this, sir. She talks about you constantly. You clearly mean the world to her." I said that feeling was mutual. He said, "I've actually been hoping for a chance to talk with you privately." I waited. "I work with a lot of families," he said, "helping them protect what they've built. It's not just numbers to me, it's legacy. Making sure the people you love are taken care of when you're gone." He paused. "I don't want to make this awkward, but if you'd ever like to sit down and talk through your own picture, I'd genuinely love to help. No obligation. Just a conversation." I told him I appreciated that. Carol came back with the coffee. My daughter came back from the restroom. We talked about other things, and Richard was charming for the rest of the evening. And when they left, he shook my hand again and told me dinner was wonderful. Carol stood next to me in the doorway, and we watched his car pull out. She said, "He's polished." I said, "Very." She looked at me. Carol has been looking at me for 31 years, and she has learned things about my face that I don't fully understand myself. She said, "What is it?" I told her I didn't know yet. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay there running the dinner back through my head the way I used to run case files, looking for the thing that was sitting wrong. It wasn't any one moment. It was the shape of the whole evening. The lateness, the wine. The compliments calibrated exactly right. And then that pivot smooth, relaxed, almost casual, toward my finances. My legacy. What I'd built. He'd been in my house for 3 hours, and he'd already made an approach. I got up at 4 in the morning and went to my office and started searching. Richard Ashworth. Wealth management, the city my daughter had mentioned. The firm name he dropped once during dinner, Ashworth Private Capital. I found a website that looked professional enough on the surface, but had been registered 8 months ago. The address on the site was a shared office suite downtown, the kind of place you rent by the hour. No physical office. No staff directory that led anywhere real. The credentials he'd listed. I spent an hour checking each one against the licensing databases I still knew how to access. One of them had expired. One of them belonged to a Richard Ashworth, who had a disciplinary action filed in another state, under a slightly different version of his name, not a different person. The same person. I sat back in my chair. 22 years had taught me something about the moment when a case becomes real. There's a stillness to it. Not excitement, stillness. Like the whole situation settles into focus, and you can see the edges of it. I went back to bed. I didn't tell Carol yet. I lay in the dark and thought about my daughter laughing at the dinner table, and I made myself breathe slowly. The next morning, I called a friend of mine. Someone I'd worked with for years, now private sector, still sharp. I gave him the name and the firm and the state where the disciplinary action had been filed. I asked him to pull everything he could find without making noise. He asked me if this was personal. I said it was very personal. He said he'd get back to me in a few days. I had coffee with my daughter that Wednesday. I didn't ask about Richard directly. I asked how things were going generally, and she smiled into her cup and said, "Really well, actually." She said he made her feel safe. I nodded and asked what that meant to her, and she said he paid attention. He remembered things. He'd shown up to her clinic once with lunch because she'd mentioned in passing that she had a long shift coming up. Little things, she said. He was good at the little things. I know now. And I knew then, sitting across from her in that coffee shop, that the little things are the whole strategy. They're not incidental. They are the architecture. I asked as casually as I could manage whether he'd ever talked to her about money stuff, investments, planning, anything like that. She said, yeah, a little. He'd offered to look at her retirement accounts. She thought it was sweet that he wanted to help. I said that was nice of him. She looked at me the same way Carol sometimes looks at me. She said, "Dad, what's going on?" I told her I was just asking. I told her the pot roast must have been too rich, because I'd had a weird night. She laughed and let it go, and I hated myself a little for lying to her. But I wasn't ready. I needed to know more before I said anything. I'd been wrong about people before. Not often, but I'd been wrong, and she was happy, and I was not going to take that apart based on a feeling and an expired credential. My friend called me Thursday evening. He said, "Okay, so your guy has been doing this for at least 6 years that I can trace clearly. 3 different states. Different firm names each time. He targets women in their 30s. Professional, educated, not naive, which is important because educated women are easier to approach through legitimate-seeming financial conversation. He builds a romantic relationship first, 3 to 5 months, and then begins integrating financial access gradually. He's good at it. He's very good at it. He's never been criminally charged. There was a civil suit in Georgia that settled out of court with an NDA. The woman lost about $60,000. I wrote down everything he told me. He said, "Is it your daughter?" I said, "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You want to burn him down or you want to protect her first?" I said both. I wanted both. He said he'd make some calls. I told Carol that night. We sat at the kitchen table after dinner, and I laid it out for her plainly because Carol deserves plainness. She has always handled hard things better when she has the whole picture. She listened without interrupting, which is something she's very good at. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "She's going to be devastated." I said I knew. Carol said, "We have to do this exactly right." I said I knew that too. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine and said, "Tell me what you need from me." That's 31 years. That's what that looks like. The plan took 2 weeks to put together properly. The core idea came from my friend who had done this kind of thing in civil litigation before. Richard had approached me at dinner about my finances, my legacy, as he'd called it, so we were going to give him what he'd asked for. I called my daughter and told her that I'd been thinking about what Richard had mentioned at dinner, about sitting down and talking through our financial picture. I said Carol and I had talked about it and we thought it might be a good idea, actually. Get some outside perspective. I told her I wondered if Richard might be willing to meet with us. She sounded so pleased. She said she'd ask him. He called me himself the next morning. He sounded warm and unhurried and said he'd be honored, and we set a meeting for the following Saturday at our house. He said he'd bring some materials. Carol and I spent that week preparing. My friend had contacts. A forensic accountant who understood what we were doing and why, and who agreed to help us set up a documented paper trail of what would unfold. We created a profile, a couple in their late 60s, modest retirement savings, a house with significant equity, a small inheritance that Carol had received from her mother. All of it real, all of it accurate, nothing hidden or invented, because I needed anything that happened in that meeting to be real. I needed him to respond to real information. I needed documentation of a real approach. I also set up recording. In our state, it's legal to record a conversation you are a party to. I was a party to every conversation that happened in my own house. The night before he came, Carol and I sat on the back porch. It was a cool evening, clear, and we could hear the neighbor's kids somewhere down the street. Carol had her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, and she was looking out at the yard. She said, "I keep thinking about what she said, that he makes her feel safe." I said, "I know." She said, "That's the cruelest part of it." I didn't have anything to add to that, so I just sat with her. Richard arrived on time for this meeting. 10 in the morning, on the dot, which told me he understood this was a different kind of appointment. He was dressed more formally than he'd been for dinner. Not a suit, but close. He had a leather folder with him. He shook my hand and hugged Carol and said the house looked wonderful, and we brought him to the dining room table because I wanted it to feel businesslike. He opened the folder. He had printed materials, charts, projections, the kind of thing that looks authoritative if you don't know how to read it. He asked us questions about our situation, and we answered them honestly, and I watched him work. He was skilled. He built rapport constantly, weaving it into every exchange, nodding at the right moments, reflecting language back at us, making Carol feel heard when she spoke, which I noticed her noticing. The whole approach was layered. It was genuinely impressive in the way that dangerous things can be, impressive when you're watching them from a safe distance. About 40 minutes in, he started to move. He said there were some opportunities he'd been thinking about since our dinner, things he didn't mention then because he didn't want to be inappropriate, but now that we were here in a more formal context, he thought it would be irresponsible not to share them. He said the traditional vehicles, the IRAs, the 401ks, were fine, but fine was not the same as optimal, and at our stage of life, optimal mattered. I asked him what he had in mind. He talked about a private fund. Exclusive access, he said, the kind of thing that wasn't available to the general public. He said his clients in this program had seen consistent returns in the range of 11 to 14% annually, which he said carefully, with the right legal language about past performance, but with enough warmth in his delivery that the language felt like a formality rather than a warning. He said he'd want to start small, just to build the relationship, maybe 50,000, to see how he felt about it. Carol reached across the table and put her hand on my arm. That was her signal to me. We had agreed on it beforehand. I leaned back in my chair. I said, "Richard, I'd like to ask you something, and I want you to answer me honestly." He smiled and said, "Of course." I said, "Do you actually have a valid Series 65 license in this state right now?" The smile stayed on his face for exactly 1 second too long, then it shifted, not disappeared, but shifted. He said he wasn't sure what I meant. I said, "Your license lapsed 14 months ago. The renewal was filed late, and there's a pending status issue that hasn't been resolved." which means you are not currently a registered investment advisor in this state, which means this conversation we've been having for the last 45 minutes, everything you've told us about this fund, these returns, this opportunity, constitutes unlicensed solicitation of investment. That's not a civil matter, Richard. That's criminal. He was very still. I said, I also know about Georgia. I know about the NDA. I know about the woman who lost $60,000 and signed a piece of paper because she was embarrassed, and she wanted it to be over. I paused. I have been recording this conversation since you sat down, which is legal in this state. I have a forensic accountant who has been retained to document everything, and I have a former colleague who is currently sharing what he's compiled with the State Securities Division. His face had gone through several things while I was talking. He'd landed somewhere that wasn't quite calm but was trying to be. He said, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I said, there hasn't been. Carol said quietly, my daughter trusted you. He looked at her. I don't know what he saw in Carol's face, but whatever it was, he didn't say anything after that. I told him I wanted him to close the folder, leave the materials on the table, and walk out of my house. I told him that my daughter would be calling him today, and that however that conversation went was between them, but that if he contacted her again after that call, if he contacted either of us, if he made any attempt to reach any member of my family, the documentation I had would go to the state AG's office, the SEC, and 3 investigative journalists I had personally known for years who covered financial fraud. He picked up his empty leather folder and he walked out. I sat there for a moment after I heard the front door close. Carol came around the table and stood beside me with her hand on my shoulder, and I put my hand over hers, and we stayed like that for a little while. The hardest part of that day was still ahead of us. My daughter came over that afternoon. We hadn't told her in advance what had happened. We'd asked her to come by for coffee, just that. She walked in looking the way she always looks on a Saturday afternoon, hair pulled back, comfortable clothes, and she could tell immediately that something had happened. Carol hugged her for just a half second longer than usual, and my daughter looked at me over Carol's shoulder with a question on her face. We sat in the living room and I told her everything, from the beginning. The pivot at dinner, the research, the phone call with my friend, the recording, the meeting that morning. I gave her the whole picture because she deserved the whole picture, and because she was going to need to understand all of it in order to process it. She didn't say anything for a long time after I finished. Then she said, "How long have you known?" I told her about 2.5 weeks from the time I started to be sure. She said, "You sat across from me at coffee and you already knew." I said I thought I knew. I didn't want to tell her until I was certain. She nodded slowly. She was looking at the floor. She said, "He showed up at my clinic with lunch." I said, "I know." She said, "I told him about my retirement account." I said she hadn't done anything wrong. She was quiet again for a while. Then she said, "What happens to him?" I told her what I'd told him. That the documentation had been shared with the Securities Division, that his licensing situation alone was a serious problem, that the pattern my friend had documented across multiple states created a picture that prosecutors could work with if they chose to. I told her I couldn't promise what would happen, but that he had been seen, that there was a record now, that the next person would have a better chance because of what we documented. She looked up at me and said, "You did all of this quietly, while I was just going to coffee with him." I told her that was the job. That's what it had always been. Moving carefully, making sure, not breaking something until you knew what you were building instead. She said, "Why didn't you tell me sooner? I would have helped." I said I know she would have. I said that was part of why I didn't tell her sooner. She laughed a little at that, which is the sound I have loved since she was 2 years old, and Carol reached over and took her hand. She called him that evening. I don't know exactly what she said. That was private. It was hers. But the call was short. Whatever she told him, he didn't respond. His number was disconnected within 48 hours. The State Securities Division opened a formal inquiry. My friend, who had forwarded the compiled documentation, told me 3 weeks later that they had identified 2 other women in our state who had been approached by Richard in the past year, and that they were cooperating. I don't know where that process ends up. These things are slow and they're complicated, and outcomes are never guaranteed. But there is a file now. There is a record. That matters. My daughter is doing well. She's been to dinner twice since then, and both times she ate 2 helpings of Carol's pot roast, which Carol takes as the highest possible compliment, and I think is probably accurate. She's not dating anyone right now, and she says she's okay with that for a while. She told me last month she's been thinking a lot about her clients, the veterans she works with, and how hard it is for people who have been hurt to trust again, and how much patience that takes, from the person trying and from the people around them. She said she understands it better now. I think that's the thing about this work. The work I did for 22 years and the other 10 years, and this one Saturday morning in my own dining room. It doesn't fix the hurt. It can't fix the hurt. But it can create the conditions for something better. It can make a record. It can slow a pattern down. It can put a file in a drawer somewhere that means the next person has one more thing on their side. Carol said to me that night, after our daughter had gone home and we were cleaning up the coffee cups, she said, "You know she's going to be okay." I said, "I know." She said, "I mean it. She's got your instincts." I thought about that. My daughter, sitting in that living room, the first thing she asked was how long I'd known. Not what did he do, not how could he, but how long did you know? She was already trying to understand the shape of it. Yeah, she's got the instincts. I washed the cups. Carol dried them and put them back in the cabinet. Outside, it was getting dark and the neighborhood was quiet, and in the morning everything would still need doing. The yard, the groceries, the ordinary Tuesday things that make up a life. I have learned over 67 years that the ordinary Tuesday things are not less important than the dramatic ones. They are, in fact, more important. They are the whole point. Richard Ashworth, or whatever his name actually is, in whatever county he's currently working in, is still out there. I am realistic about that. The world is full of people who have made a skill out of finding the thing someone needs most and pretending to offer it. There is no final solution to that. There is only the work, the patient, careful, unglamorous work of paying attention, keeping records, knowing what you're looking at, and making sure that when someone you love needs you to see something, you are someone who can be trusted to see it clearly. I don't think of what I did as anything unusual. I think of it as the job. But when my daughter hugged me on the porch before she got in her car that Saturday evening, she held on for a little longer than usual, and she said quietly into my shoulder, "I knew you'd figure it out." I hadn't figured anything out. I'd just been paying attention. And that's all it ever was. I've been thinking about cause and effect a lot lately. Not in any abstract way, just the plain, practical version of it that you start to see clearly when you've lived long enough to watch things play out. Richard didn't become what he was overnight. Nobody does. He built it, choice by choice, approach by approach, woman by woman, until the whole thing ran almost automatically. Show up slightly late. Bring the right wine. Ask the right questions. Remember the small things. Make her feel seen. Make her feel safe. And then, once the trust was deep enough, reach for the thing you actually came for. He had refined that sequence over 6 years across 3 states, and it worked because most people aren't watching for it. Most people extend good faith because that's the reasonable thing to do, and he had learned how to live inside other people's good faith, like a parasite lives inside a host. But here's the part that matters to me. Sitting here now on the other side of it, the same patience that made him dangerous is the same quality that made it possible to stop him. You cannot rush that kind of work. You cannot go on instinct alone and burn something down before you're certain, because uncertain action causes its own damage. It damages the person you're trying to protect. It damages the trust they've placed in you. It hands the other person a way out. I had to be slow. I had to be thorough. I had to sit across from my daughter at a coffee shop, knowing what I suspected, and talk about other things, because the moment wasn't right yet, and the wrong move would have cost her more than I was willing to cost her. That's not a natural thing. It goes against every instinct a father has, but I have learned, through 22 years of work and 31 years of marriage and 67 years of being a person on this earth, That the instinct to act immediately is not always wisdom. Sometimes wisdom is the willingness to hold still when everything in you wants to move. To gather, to verify, to build something solid before you put your weight on it. Carol knew this. She didn't panic when I told her. She said, "Tell me what you need from me." And then she did exactly that. No more and no less. That is a kind of intelligence that doesn't get enough credit. The intelligence of knowing your role in a situation and filling it completely without needing it to be more dramatic than it is. My daughter knew something was wrong before she had evidence for it. She couldn't have told you why. She just felt it. Some quiet misalignment between what Richard presented and what she sensed underneath it. And instead of dismissing that feeling or talking herself out of it, she trusted it enough to act on it, even if the only action available to her was slipping a piece of paper to her father at the dinner table. That took more courage than it probably sounds like. She didn't know what I would do with it. She didn't know if I'd see what she saw. She just trusted that paying attention to the thing that felt wrong was better than pretending it wasn't there. That's the through line in all of it. Attention. Patience. The willingness to do the unglamorous work of being thorough when urgency is pulling at you. These are not exciting qualities. They don't make for good stories at parties. But they are the qualities that actually hold things together. Families, cases, lives. Richard will keep moving. He'll recalibrate and find a new city and a new name variation and start the sequence again. I am realistic about that. But there is a file now. There is a record, and my daughter, who trusted her gut and trusted me, is sitting across a dinner table on a Saturday with 2 helpings of pot roast in front of her and her whole life still intact. That's not nothing. In fact, it's everything.